I was speaking of my individual sovereignty because it's not something that I thought about all of my life, and I imagine you didn't either. But it's something that is absolutely fundamental today in 2017, and it comes from the three sovereignties in our U.S. Constitution, and they're in order. The first one is the individual sovereignty, yours and mine, we the people. That's the first one. The framers put that in on purpose first. The second one is the sovereignty of the states, at the time the 13 colonies, the states. It is the states that created the federal government with very limited enumerated powers. The framers are very concerned about a federal government overtaking the sovereignty of states, and they did everything they could in that Constitution to stop that from happening. One of the things that is not in the Constitution, there is no text within the Constitution that creates a tribal sovereignty. Or the framers and founders never even contemplated tribal governments. That was a fiction first created by the Supreme Court in the 1830s. A fiction where the federal Supreme Court, in three cases called the Marshall Trilogy in 1830, ruled that the federal government had a duty to the dependent ward Indians in our country. They had a trust relationship. That federal trust relationship was created by the U.S. Supreme Court in the 1830s. Well, Congress took that ruling seriously and started from the 1830s on setting up reservations, bounded areas where Indians would be safe from the settlers, started executing treaties and providing provisions every year to these reservations and tribal governments. At the same time, Congress was busy settling the West. So we had from the 1830s until the 1880s, we had about a 50-year period where Congress was conflicted, where it had a trust relationship to take care of the Indians, but it's also trying to settle the Western territories and create states. And it's saying, go west, young man. Young man went west. Young man went west with his wagon, whatever he could put in it. The same sturdy character that whose ancestors were the Pilgrims and the Jamestown people. Young man went west into the unknown, found a piece of ground. Congress said, you find a piece of ground, you improve that piece of ground, you can homestead it, and it's yours. And young man built his farm, his family, his schools, his churches, his communities, and young man settled the West. And he got no federal provisions to do so. None. During the same time period, the country was struggling with slavery and building up to the Civil War. So our country was really a youthful country with many problems and many conflicts, and Congress was doing what it could for the Indians, doing what it could to settle the West, doing what it could to deal with slavery. We were, in the 1850s, we were a country that was providing for Native Americans at all points in time. We were not providing for the settlers. We were not providing, the federal government was not providing for anyone else, and we were still treating black Americans as though they weren't even human. You know, it was Uncle Tom's Cabin. Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote a book that changed the perception of the country to realize blacks are humans and slavery's wrong. And that was in 1857, even before the Civil War. But nonetheless, my point is, all along, the federal government has looked after and funded Native Americans, tribal governments, and Indian reservations, as opposed to anybody else. And yet, when you listen to the perspective of tribal governments, not all tribal members by any shot. And mind you, I am Cherokee ancestry, my husband is Shoshone, and most tribal members are extremely loyal to the country, many in the service, So not tribal members, but tribal governments love to just shout to the rooftops, you stole our land. We were here first. You know, and the answer to that is no one stole your land. Those treaties were sales contracts, and you were amply paid multiple times over through the treaties and through the Indian Claims Commission in the 1950s. Land was paid for to the Indians many times over. No one stole the land. And the we were here first, it has no constitutional effect whatsoever. The Constitution doesn't provide a special preference for anyone that was here first or second or the 340th million American citizen. We're American citizens, and we're equal, and we have inalienable rights, and we're all American citizens under our Constitution. So the we were here first and you stole our land are propaganda tools that have been pounded into the K through 12 curriculum, pounded into mainstream media, pounded into with lobbyists rolling through Congress constantly, just absolutely disparaging this country that is the envy of the world. The envy of the world. And the disparaging is coming from the very tribal leaders who were the only ones to benefit throughout these years of our country. And there's no thank you. There's no thank you whatsoever. It's like, get out. We were here first. We've been here since time immemorial. There's another beautiful phrase, time immemorial. Oh yes, they've been here. The indigenous people have been here since time immemorial, and everybody else needs to leave. That is, time immemorial started September 1789 with the adoption of the U.S. Constitution. That's what time in this government, that's when it started, September 1789. Anything that preceded time, that date, is not part of the U.S. Constitution or our governing system whatsoever. So, why do I talk about this? Because we've had 8 years of dividing us up by ethnicity, by income levels, by religion. We've had 8 years of intentional pitting of one American against another. In the meantime, American Indians are struggling on their reservations. Their leaders are bashing the country at every opportunity, and they have an enormous gaming monopoly that started in 1988, in which the money is free money for them because we federally subsidize all the basic needs of tribes. We subsidize their food, their housing, their health, their education, their courts, their cultural resources. The American taxpayer pays for all that. So the gaming money is free money, and they use it to buy legislators, elected officials. They buy land and grow their boundaries, which falls out of a state's boundary and jurisdiction. They buy lobbyists that roam the hall of Congress saying more, more, enough is never enough. And they buy litigators, legal counsel. It's a burgeoning industry for legal counsel. This Indian industry are your lobbyists, your legal counsels, your radical tribal leaders who have now joined forces with environmental extremists, with the United Nations and Agenda 2030 folks. They all have one thing in common. They're all adversarial to the United States. At the same time, they're our fellow American. And that's where we have to start talking to each other.